أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Hope everybody's well in this 16th day of the holy month of Ramadan. We're already halfway done with the holy month, and we still have the other half left, inshallah, which is the more important half, you can say, maybe, with the nights of Qadr in it and so on. Before I begin, I would like to just make sure to let everyone know that I will not be available coming next week and the week after. So this is our last session, probably in the holy month of Ramadan, most probably. But yeah, we'll let you know if anything changes. So if you had noticed, maybe in the flyer that went out for the month of Ramadan, the dates that had been assigned to me, in parentheses next to them, it said subject to change, right? And so that's what's going on. It's due to my availability. And so now I will repeat this announcement in the end as well, just to make sure everyone knows that this is happening. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Regarding last week's session, going over the different articles that we went through last week. Article number 57, we were talking about prophethood, of course, the prophets and their miracles. So Article 57 spoke about the logical link between prophethood and miracles. In other words, if God will not give miracles to somebody that is not a prophet, because this is going to be the only way people can really ascertain that someone is a prophet actually, and God knows that. God knows that the only way people can ascertain the truthfulness of the claim of somebody who says they're a prophet, then God also understands this. And if God also understands this, then He's not going to give miracles to someone who is not a prophet. In other words, because of this understanding that we have, it is so that we see miracles as the sign of the truthfulness of a prophet's claim. Okay. So that's Article 57. Article 58 speaks about what we call kiramat, which are extraordinary acts that are performed by people, but are not miracles, are not classified theologically as miracles. For example, Lady Maryam, and how there was sustenance coming down on her. Or the story of Barkhia, I think his name was, who was able to bring the throne of the Queen of Sheba in the blinking of an eye for Prophet Sulaiman. They can do extraordinary things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are prophets. Now, so then what does constitute a miracle? How do we know that a miracle is a miracle? That's where we got to Article 59, where the conditions for an extraordinary act classifying as a miracle were mentioned and listed. So over there what we have is that there was like 4 or 5 conditions. Number 1 was that this extraordinary act should not be the type of act that can be taught to others. If it's something that's taught and passed down, then it's not a miracle. Why? Because miracle, the definition of it was that it has to be something that shows that you are in touch with God and that God gave you this power. If it's taught by others, that means God didn't have anything to do with it. So that's number 1. Number 2 was the fact that it cannot be contradicted or countered. If God is the most powerful entity and being out there, and He gives the power of miracles to somebody, and that somebody performs that miracle, if that miracle can be countered and defeated, then that shows that the person this guy was in touch with wasn't actually God. It was somebody else apparently who's not strong enough to beat everyone else out there. If you are going to perform a miracle, you cannot be countered by people. You have to be able to be the one that's on top all the time with your miracle. That's why, for example, Prophet Musa alayhi salam, when he threw and when he cast his staff, it devoured whatever else the Quran says of the magicians had performed and had done of sorcery, of magic. Yeah, because why? Because the source of his miracle is other than the source of the miracle of those magicians. Their source of magic was different things that they had learned and so on. But the source of the miracle of Musa alayhi salam was Allah Himself. And so it is very clear that a person who is performing a miracle cannot be countered by anyone else. Or else that will show that this extraordinary act came from something other than God. Wa alaikum assalam, brother, and welcome. Number 3 condition that was mentioned was that miracles are not supposed to be confined to a certain genre of miracles. If someone really is a prophet and is after convincing the people about their prophethood, then if the people are only convinced by a different set of miracles that have nothing to do with each other, then the prophet has to bring those miracles. It doesn't matter if it's not the case that a prophet can do only card tricks, God forbid, and that's enough to prove to make the point. No, not necessarily. If a prophet really is in touch with God, that means they can perform all sorts of miracles. It shouldn't be confined to one type of miracle only. Yeah. And so this is also important. Now, does that mean that prophets would actually perform different varieties of miracles? Not necessarily. What matters in God's eyes and in the eyes of the prophets is that the people who see the miracle are convinced. If they're convinced, that's enough. Now someone might come and say, hey, it would be nice if you could, split the moon in half and have some, have some chocolate liquid ooze out of it. Well, that would be nice, yes, but the prophet doesn't have to do it if he's already, split the mountain and a camel has come out, like Prophet Saleh. Yeah? What matters with miracles is that people are convinced that this guy has a connection with God, with the divine. If they're convinced, that prophet's not going to necessarily listen to every detail, every request that they have for miracles, But at the same time, a prophet should be able to perform any type of miracle. And it shouldn't be confined to just one type. One more thing that he said here, the last condition that Ayatollah Subhani had in his book was that these prophets who are bringing these miracles, they should not be inviting people to themselves and promoting themselves in a way that their personal interests are satisfied and so on. Lots of times people will do extraordinary acts that you can't even counter maybe, but in the end, what's the guy after? The guy's after some big prize, right? Like these TV shows that they have where people come and perform certain acts and try to get first place. When they get first place, they get a big pile of money. Yeah, the guy wins $100,000. Or well, that's what this person was after. This person was after himself in the end, not after what God wants. So sometimes someone might perform an extraordinary act, but since they're inviting the people to themselves, it won't make it a miracle either. It won't show that this person is necessarily a prophet. When we look at the prophets, they're always inviting people to Allah, and they're not after their own interests. قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا, the Quran says, tell the people, I'm not after a reward, compensation from you. In ajri illa, my ajr and reward is only on who? The Lord of the worlds, or Allah, whatever the verse says. So sometimes the other conditions are met, maybe, but this condition is not met. So that also shows that this person is not a prophet. One more condition that he doesn't have here, Ayatollah Subhani, but I added last week, and I thought is very important and necessary really, is that the fact that if someone wants to, if an extraordinary act is going to be classified as a miracle, theologically a miracle, that means that the one who's bringing and performing that act should have the claim of prophethood. I'm surprised that this condition is not mentioned here. As I said last week, he might have kind of implied it in previous articles, But it would have been nice, I think, if he had listed it here next to the rest of these items. Why? And usually in conventional theology books, I think this might be one of the first conditions that is mentioned for an extraordinary act to be classified as a miracle. Why? Because there are people out there who are very righteous, who are doing who sometimes might even do something that is not teachable, cannot be countered by anyone or defeated. All these conditions are met, yet the person still isn't a prophet. Come on, brothers and sisters, like let's be real here. Imam Ali alayhi salam, the way he tore the door of Khaybar, the gate of that castle of Khaybar, the fortress or fort of Khaybar, a door that maybe 10 people couldn't even carry later on after the battle was over. Imam Ali did that single-handedly. So this is an extraordinary act, not taught, it's not teachable to be able to lift something like that. And it's not something that can be countered. No one else was able to lift the door. All of these different conditions are meant for it to be a miracle. But does that mean Imam Ali is a prophet now because what he did meets all these conditions? All these conditions are met? No. Why? Because Imam Ali never had the claim of prophethood. As a matter of fact, in Nahj al-Balagha, I think, someone tells Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says, "Are you a prophet?" Because of all the wisdom that he's hearing from Imam Ali. You know what Imam Ali's response is? Very famously, Imam Ali says, "Ana abdun min abidi Muhammad." I am a servant of the servants, among the servants of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa sallam. Ana abdun min abidi Muhammad. I'm just one of those guys. That's all I am. Right? So he never had the claim of prophethood. He never had the claim of prophethood, but that doesn't make what he did of extraordinary acts, doesn't make those extraordinary acts miracles. Why? Because it lacks this condition of having the claim of prophethood as well. Okay. We moved on to Article 60 and how revelation is the way that there is a connection between the divine and the earth. And that happens through a prophet, of course. And we spoke a little bit about that, or the article spoke a little bit about that, and just wanted to really drive this point home that when we talk about revelation, it is something that is metaphysical. So we won't be able to understand it thoroughly. Although some people think that they can, or they try to, but no, that's not the case. It cannot be understood. It is one of those things that is of the ghaib, that the Surah Baqarah says, الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ, that one of those conditions for proper faith is that we also believe in the unseen. There are certain things out there that we cannot see but exist. The first and foremost of them being Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Article 61 gave us a little glimpse of what some people, some materialists and scientists might even say about what? Not scientists, sociologists and so on. Even psychologists sometimes. Of these great thinkers of the, I think they were mostly in Europe actually, what they say about what revelation is, what their take on revelation is, how they justify revelation. They're atheists, so they'll have to have an explanation for revelation. Some of them say that these prophets were very good people, and so they would sit and reflect. And through this reflection, they would come to certain conclusions, and they would say that this is revelation. Others of them might say that no, revelation isn't their own ideas, their own thoughts, but rather it is a result of all of the worship that these righteous people do, and then certain things become apparent to them. The source of these conclusions is themselves and their souls, but they think that God has put it in their hearts. Yeah, so that's why it's called, and that's why they think it's revelation. So there's different things that are said, of course, out there regarding prophets and revelation, and these people are geniuses, and that's why they come up with certain things and they think it's revelation, etc. But he answers all of those, at least two of the ones that he covers here, he answers them in article number 61. And finally, it brings us to, we're finally done with the going over what we covered last week. It brings us to the infallibility of prophets. Article 62 is where we start today. Infallibility of the prophets. Okay, so number one, prophets have to bring miracles with them, or else people won't acknowledge their prophethood. People won't listen to them. And that's number one. Number two, infallibility. Another condition for prophets, something that is super important is infallibility, although we need to discuss the scope of this infallibility. He says in this article, Article 62, he says when we say infallibility and infallibility or ismah, what is meant is three things. So that's the scope of it. Three things prophets can be infallible in. Number one, in receiving revelation from the divine, preserving it and transmitting it to the people. Number one. Number two, infallibility from sin and disobedience of God. Number three, infallibility from mistakes. Sometimes you make a mistake in life, brothers and sisters. Not necessarily that you disobey God. You make a mistake. You drop something, it breaks. I don't know. You accidentally take the life of somebody, God forbid even. You crash somewhere and people die. I don't know. Things like that. These are mistakes. Did you sin? No, you didn't sin. You didn't disobey God. Since you didn't disobey God, it's not seen as sin. But at the end of the day, it is a mistake. It's not something that was supposed to happen. So the third aspect of infallibility that needs to be discussed is infallibility when it comes to being mistaken or making mistakes. These are all things that are discussed. Now I'll say this before actually we go on. Infallibility, whether it's about the prophets, whether it's about our imams, is something that is heavily debated in the past. We have to understand this. If we are sitting here today after 1400 years very easily believing that our imams are infallible or the prophets were infallible, there has been lots of theological work and many disagreements even regarding some of the aspects of infallibility. There's one aspect though that is unanimously accepted by everyone according to Ayatollah Subhani here. He says, when it comes to infallibility in receiving revelation, preserving it and eventually transmitting it to the people, this is where all prophets are going to be infallible. And this is where everyone agrees. Everyone unanimously agrees that prophets have to have at least this much infallibility, or else we have a big problem. What is the problem? The problem is that people, anything the prophet comes to you with, there's always the chance that he's mistaken. He might be wrong about it. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe for personal reasons he didn't want to share it. Things like that. So, in order to get in the way of all of those problems and all of those things that might come to people's minds, what's for sure is that God, if He sends a prophet, that prophet's going to be infallible when it comes to receiving revelation, preserving it, and then finally transmitting it to the people. He says this is unanimously accepted. Personally, I agree with him. If you're going to have a prophet that you can't even rely on that much, then you're in bad shape. That you can't rely on even when it comes to receiving revelation. What kind of prophet is that? If God Almighty is all strong and all wise, He'll understand that at least this much we have to be able to rely on when it comes to these prophets. He brings a verse for this. عَالِمُ الْغَيْبِ فَلَا يُظْهِرُ عَلَى غَيْبِهِ أَحَدًا إِلَّا مَنْ ارْتَضَى مِنْ رَسُولٍ فَإِنَّهُ يَسْلُكُ مِنْ بَيْنِ يَدَيْهِ وَمِنْ خَلْفِهِ رَصَدًا. Which means, He is the knower of the unseen, Allah. And He reveals unto none His secrets of the unseen, of course, except unto a messenger that He has chosen. So what happens when He reveals the unseen secrets to His messenger? Then He makes a guard to go before him and a guard behind him. Right? So this Rasul or messenger that now has revelation, it says God protects him with that revelation. Yeah. So here he says this verse shows us that no, it's protected. This aspect of infallibility, even the Quran, he says, is being addressed. The Quran is addressing. Okay. Article 63 though goes into the second level or stage of isma, and the second aspect of infallibility, which is infallibility when it comes to sin and disobedience of Allah. He says that prophets are also protected, because isma, infallibility, means protection, are protected from sin and disobedience and making and doing wrong, and acting wrongfully. Why? Oh, Ayatollah Subhani. He says if this was not the case, and prophets would actually sin and disobey God, it would defeat the whole purpose. But someone might ask, why? Why is it that if prophets, we are sure that they receive revelation, it is preserved with them properly, and then they transmit it properly, but when it comes to acting upon it themselves, they might not necessarily act upon it 100%, maybe 95%, maybe 98%. Why do they have to 100% go by that same message, that same those same teachings? Who says? He says it defeats the purpose. Why? Why does it defeat the purpose? He says the same thing he said before. He says if these prophets are disobeying God, going against God and His commands, and their only job is to just transmit the commands of God, once again the people will not rely on them. The people will not take them serious. The people will feel like it'll have a negative effect on the people. Brothers and sisters, forget about prophets. Let's say me, as a person who might be seen as someone who can represent the deen, for example. If I'm not listening to God, people won't listen to me. And interestingly, the flip side holds as well. When someone acts upon what they preach, then they're also taken seriously, and people will act upon what they preach as well. And so now let's take it to the prophet's level. A prophet of God that is in touch with the divine is not taking God's command seriously. Now, you want people to take him seriously, or to take those commands seriously? No. It defeats the purpose, he says. And other theologians have said the same thing. So he brings 3 verses here. Surah An'am 87, وَاجْتَبَيْنَاهُمْ وَهَدَيْنَاهُمْ إِلَىٰ صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. That we chose prophets and guided them to the straight path. 1. Second verse, وَمَنْ يَهْدِ اللَّهِ فَمَا لَهُ مِنْ مُضِلٍّ. Whoever God guides, no one can misguide. Okay, so the first verse says that we guided the prophets to the straight path. Another verse says if God guides somebody, no one's going to misguide them. No one's going to be able to misguide them. Right? That's number 2. Number 3, it says sin. He brings a verse to prove that sin is a form of misguidance. وَلَقَدْ أَضَلَّ مِنْكُمْ جِبِلًّا كَثِيرًا. Surah Yasin. That shaitan has misguided a lot of you. Let me see the exact translation that's used here. Jibillan kathira. A great multitude here it says. So he brings these 3 verses. I like what he does here actually. He says, it's one verse, Surah An'am, says we chose the prophets and guided them. Another verse, Surah Zumar, says when we guide somebody, no one can misguide them. Misguidance doesn't always mean them turning away from God. It can also mean sin. Who says? The 3rd verse, وَلَقَدْ أَضَلَّ مِنْكُمْ جِبِلًّا كَثِيرًا. That shaitan has misguided a good multitude of you people. Misguidance here means sin. So through these 3 verses together, the package, not that each separately is proving this point, these 3 together, he says, prove the point that prophets, when it comes to disobedience of God, there is no such thing. They are obedient servants of God. Okay? In addition to these verses, in addition to what was said before, he says, we have to also understand that these prophets, even them before them becoming prophet, have to be sinless, which is interesting. Although they're not, they haven't become prophet yet. But still, that itself, the fact that they are going to be prophet in the future, also is reason to know and be sure that they are sinless even before being chosen as prophets. Interesting. Give us your reasons. He says, reason number 1, the same thing we said before. Think about it. If there are people who are going to come out and say they're prophets, but we know that before they were idol worshippers, before they were sinners, before, God forbid, they were drinking, before they were adulterers, before this, before that, people won't take them seriously again. It defeats the purpose. If God All-Wise wants to make sure that people follow His prophets, He has to make sure that they don't have something in them that turns people away from them. This is something that turns people away. Think about it. We all live in different centers across the world, Shia Islamic centers, whatever, right? Think about it. If somebody has been bad all their life and now comes and starts preaching us, yeah? No. He says that's not the case. Now this can be contested though. Some people will counter or have a counter argument to this argument. That look, that holds for, if a person has been bad all their life. But this doesn't prove that maybe a prophet before becoming prophet, let's say the prophet became prophet at the age of 40, doesn't mean that from age 15 when they become baligh, for example, to age 40, it's impossible for them to have only committed one sin in their life, Because if someone commits one sin, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to be turned off by them after they become prophet, right? So someone might have a counter argument to this argument, but at the end of the day, this is his argument. He says it'll defeat the purpose even if they've committed one sin in their lifetime before being prophet. His second reason for why prophets have to be ma'soom and infallible even before becoming prophet. He says, because if you have made mistakes, sinned before becoming prophet, once you do become prophet, that can be held against you by those who have ill intentions towards you. Yeah? The enemies of the message of the prophets can easily come and say, people, you're following somebody who, just like you, was sinning before. How could you follow someone like that? If God is going to send somebody to us, He says, send somebody to us that at least respects the religion of God Himself before being prophet even. So he says that's number 2. Number 3 reason is that when a person throughout their life, even before becoming prophet, has been righteous and clean from sin, then what they say and do after they become prophet has a huge effect on the people, versus if they were sinning before becoming prophet. Once again, this holds if they were continuously sinning before they were prophet. But if someone has sinned once only, I don't know if this would be convincing for everyone. Yeah. So, at the end of the day, these are reasons he brings to kind of push this idea forward that prophets are infallible even before becoming prophet. Article 64 speaks about the last aspect of infallibility. So far we discussed the first aspect, which is infallibility in receiving revelation, preserving it, and transmitting it to the people. Aspect number 2 was infallibility when it comes to sinning and disobedience of God. Article 64 talks about the third aspect of infallibility, and that is not making mistakes even in life. This one is an interesting one and a tough one to prove, I will say. Until today, some people might be against this. Okay? But mainstream right now mainstream Shia school might hold that, yes, Imams are infallible even in this aspect. Prophets, are infallible even in this aspect. That they won't even make mistakes in the slightest things. So he'll give some examples. He gives 4 examples here. 4 examples here for this. He says number 1, when it comes to, he talks about 4 things. Unfortunately, the book here was worded a little bit weird, and so I felt like it's a little misleading. We want to talk about 4 things here, okay, that prophets might make mistakes in. Dissect them. Number 1 is when they judge amongst people. When they judge amongst people, they might sometimes make mistakes. We've had this case in the Quran even with Prophet, I think Dawood or Sulaiman, I think it was Dawood, where he made a judgment, but it might have been mistaken. Why? Because he kind of based the judgment on a certain thing that he wasn't supposed to. Right? Now here, in these cases, Ayatollah Subhani explains that, look, the prophets have to go with ilm of the zahir, which means they just have to go with what they see outside. For example, Islam, when it comes to judging amongst people, Islam has a certain way. For example, let me tell you. If you go to Imam Ali alayhi salam, you tell him, look, me and my friend, we are having a dispute. Over what? Over this book. Who it belongs to. If I'm holding the book and my friend isn't, and we go to the Imam and we want to settle our argument like with going to the Imam, what's the Imam going to say? What does Islam say here? Islam, the Islamic system, that judiciary system of Islam says that if you want to judge, whoever is holding the book, okay, doesn't have to prove anything. The person who's not holding the book has to bring a bayyinah. Now, bayyinah means proof, but Islamically, there's certain things that we have that are seen as proof, which are referred to as bayyinah. He has to bring a bayyinah that might show that this book, and prove that this book belongs to him actually, although you're the one holding it. For example, 2 just witnesses that this belongs to him. Then Imam Ali will take this book from me and give it to that person. But if I don't have that proof, then Imam Ali will turn back to me and say, you, O person who has the book, do a qasam and swear to Allah that this belongs to you. And I'll do that, and then the book will remain in my hands and in my possession. Now Imam Ali alayhi salam might know even in his knowledge, or Prophet Dawood or Sulaiman might know in their with the divine knowledge that they have, that the book actually doesn't belong to me, it belongs to somebody, the other person, and I actually stole it from them. Okay? He might know that. But right now, Islamically, and during the times of the prophets and the imams, they were ordered to go by that system that Islam has put in place for judging amongst the people. Very simple. So that is what they have to go by. Someone might say, look, Imam Ali told me that the book belongs to me, but he was mistaken. The book belonged to somebody else. Imam Ali didn't say it really belongs to you. He says, going by the Islamic legal system, it belongs to you, because that's how we are supposed to judge. And that's why it's super important for people to have witnesses for whatever they do. Just witnesses. Right? Of course, where Islamic law is implemented. Out in the West, that's not the case right now. It's not. So this is irrelevant to us, but I'm just saying. To take witnesses for whatever things they do. Transactions that they do, have witnesses for it. Why? Because that is the only thing that will prove things in a court of law where Islamic laws are implemented. So, Imam Ali, when he gives me the book, he gives it to me not because in his divine knowledge he knows that it belongs to me or not. Because Islamically, Islam has said this is how you're supposed to do things. This is how you're supposed to judge amongst people and give verdicts. So that's the case. So this first one, it's not even a mistake that the Prophet made or Imam Ali made. No. They are going by what they're supposed to go by. Now, if the book doesn't belong to me really, I will be held accountable on the Day of Judgment for taking something that did not belong to me. Okay. So he says this is not where mistakes are happening. But there are other things that we have that mistakes do happen. And we have to acknowledge, like mistakes can happen. What is that? He says, when it's time to identify certain things that will have an Islamic ruling for them. For example, let's say a drop of blood falls in a glass of water. We all know that water is najis now. You're not allowed to drink it, right, brothers and sisters? So, will a prophet be mistaken and will misidentify this as being clean water and will drink it? Just because he didn't see that drop of blood fall in it, right? So mistakenly, he drinks from that, right? These are called mawdu'at al-ahkam. Will they ever make mistakes in mawdu'at al-ahkam? Things that will have a ruling for them, right? Drinking najis water is haram. This glass of water is something that I have to identify as being something drinkable or not. Is it najis or tahir? I identify it as tahir because I never saw anything fall in it, while in reality it was najis. There's a ruling for this. It's haram to drink it if you know. Will a prophet who is infallible make such a mistake or not? And I misidentify it as tahir. Now for us it's different. We don't have divine immaculate knowledge, right, brothers and sisters? So we go by what we see, what we don't see. And Islam says it's okay. But will a prophet make such a mistake or not? So that's number 2. So number 1 was when it comes to judging amongst people. Number 2, certain things that have a ruling for them. Number 3, talking about social things, social matters, making mistakes in social matters. If a prophet, for example, tells his people to do something in a certain way, later on turns out to be wrong. Now, they say in some hadiths, we don't have this in Shia sources, but they're in other books, that the Holy Prophet, he made mistakes when it came to palm trees, and how these palm trees have to be pollinated or fertilized and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, he told his people what to do, but when the time came to harvest, these trees were not yielding enough dates. And the people told the Prophet, "Oh Prophet, you told us to do things in this way, but now the trees aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing." The Prophet said, "I don't know about your dunya. You guys you know better how to take care of your dunya." Right? This, as I said, this hadith, we don't have this hadith. We don't believe in this hadith, but it's there. Is this possible or not? This is a discussion. When it comes to these types of matters, social matters, things like that, can prophets make mistakes or not? That's number 3. Number 4, normal things of life, normal, affairs of life. As I said, can a prophet, just, accidentally drop a glass and it shatters? Can a prophet accidentally step on, someone else's toe and break their toe? Things like that. So these are things that are discussed. And as you can see, it's really narrowed down now, this infallibility, to some really small details even. Right? So we had the first aspect, unanimously accepted, that when it comes to receiving revelation, preserving it, transmitting it, they are infallible, unanimously accepted amongst everybody. The second aspect was, can they sin? Mainstream Shia says that no, they cannot sin. Prophets cannot sin. Anyone who's infallible will not sin. Number 3 aspect, can they make mistakes? Mistakes had 4 categories. 1, when it comes to judgment, we said there it's not even applicable. The question is erroneous. They're not making mistakes even if they make the wrong judgment. Why? Because the wrong judgment right now is based on this, what Islam wants us to base our judgments on. And so sometimes someone's rights might be trampled. It's just unfortunate, but that's how it is. And we have to go by that. Yeah, if we know someone's rights are being trampled, we won't let that happen. But when we're not sure, we have to go by what evidence and proof provides us of the truth. Okay, so sometimes, rights might be trampled, but that's another story. Number 2, 3, and 4 were, can they make mistakes when it comes to identifying certain things that have rulings applying to them? Can they make mistakes in social matters? Can they make mistakes in normal matters of life? These are the 4. He says, those bottom 3, right? In all of these as well, no, they cannot be fallible. They have to be infallible, he says. Why? Because when they make mistakes in these things, the normal person out there, the normal lay person out there, when they notice that a prophet is making mistakes like these, this even has an effect on them taking that prophet seriously, following his commands, and living up to the message that they bring. So to this extent, Ayatollah Subhani feels that the reasoning for a prophet being infallible is strong enough. The fact that it defeats the purpose, goes against them being followed or not. Yeah? Since it goes against them being followed properly, this argument is so strong for him that he can even use it for slightest mistakes in life, even if it means stepping on someone's toe and hurting them. Okay? Now, as I said before when we started this article, Article 64, infallibility in all 3 aspects is not unanimously accepted by everybody. The first aspect, it's unanimously accepted, but the second one, seldom you'll find people who disagree with the second one, which is sin. But the third one, sometimes you will find that, no, even big ulama might have a difference of opinion there, because they're not convinced that necessarily a prophet has to have reached the point where not even a mistake that small will occur for them. Well, so there's a lot of discussion here and a lot more details, but we're going to skip all of that because he hasn't addressed them in this book. As I said before, I've explained before, this book is trying to keep things concise, just trying to get across what mainstream says. Yes, I would say mainstream Shia might even go as far as saying that prophets won't even make the slightest mistakes in their life. But yeah, there are some questions that we'll address later as well regarding some mistakes by prophets. All right, article number 40 or 65 says that look, that same reason that pushed me, Ayatollah Subhani, to the point that I would say prophets shouldn't even make mistakes, small as just normal life matters mistakes. That argument will take me as far as to say that prophets should not have within them anything that turns the people away from them, even turns people off. Okay, let me read this actually from the book. He says, one of the aspects of the isma and infallibility of the messengers is that there can be no element within their being that might serve as a source of repulsion for people. We all know that certain diseases and certain character traits, such as crudity or baseness, give rise to aversion and repulsion, people being turned off and not wanting to come to that person. The messengers must perforce be free from such bodily and psychic deformities. For the aversion of people from the Prophet is at odds with the purpose of prophethood. If people are going to be turned away from this Prophet as a result of his ugliness, his demeanor, his lowliness, right? And when you look at our imams, they were all from high families, brothers and sisters. High, not necessarily well off financially, but high in the sense of they weren't seen as abased, low people. Why? Because people will be turned away from them. They had honor, not necessarily lots of wealth. Although our imams also would work hard and they had, they were well off as well. Most of our imams, if not all of them even. They lived very humble, simple lives, but they were well off and they were helping their communities with the wealth that they had. So now anyway, what I want to say here is that what Ayatollah Subhani is trying to say is that it's at odds with, it defeats the purpose of prophethood. The purpose of prophethood was that there's a message that this individual is bringing to the people and the people have to come to them for it. But now the people are not coming to him for it. It makes sense. To be honest, I'm convinced with this one. Now, what extent is that going to be? Does that mean that they have to be like, they have to have looks like celebrities and Hollywood looks and like be very, very, not have dark complexions and stuff like, no, not necessarily. No, they're normal people at the end of the day. But they shouldn't have certain negative traits that are so negative that it turns people away from them, repels people from them. Thus, let us note, he says, that intellectual judgment functions here in the form of a disclosure of a reality. That's right. And what he's trying to say here is that this is something that, once again, our common sense brings us to. The fact that a prophet cannot have such traits. Or else you won't find in the Quran, brothers and sisters, anywhere that it says prophets shouldn't be ugly. Or should not be, have certain diseases that makes people run from them. Yeah? He said the Quran doesn't have anything like that. Who tells us that this is a condition? Our own intellect. We understand that this is the case, let alone Allah. Allah will understand even more than us. That a prophet cannot have these problems. Or else people will not come to them anymore. Now here someone might say, we have a question actually. Brother says in the Quran, it seems like the prophets did make mistakes, but Allah corrected their mistakes. This is what we'll talk about, as I said. This is something that we'll have later, inshallah, for our next session. Okay? I'm going to end after I finish this article, actually. It's important. Here we have a footnote. Ayatollah Subhani has a footnote. Yeah. Where he says... So he said, he brought up the word diseases, right? We've heard in some traditions, in some hadith, that Prophet Ayyub, or as the Old Testament might refer to him as Job, he went through a big test in his life, right? And the story is a pretty interesting one about how Shaitan. So sister, before I go on, our sister here is also asking, what about the judgment of Prophet Dawood when he judged between two brothers? Was his judgment correct? Exactly. These are things that we need to talk about later, and these are things that Ayatollah Subhani has to answer. Right? He has to answer them, but not in this book. Will he answer it? He will give us a general answer, but then he'll say more specific answers can be found in books that are more detailed. I want to keep my book concise. But yes, there are books out there that have discussed maybe every single judgment or mistake that, quote-unquote mistake, of course, that a prophet might have done, and they explain why it wasn't a mistake, or it wasn't a sin, or that, what it was exactly, what the story behind it was. As I said before, brothers and sisters, and I'm happy that these questions are coming up. This is something that is contested. There's a lot of talk here. Okay, it's not set in stone and clear cut. Okay, as I said, mainstream Shia right now believes that the prophets will not even sin and disobey God. But does that mean that sometimes they might not make mistakes? Or do we even call it mistake? Or do we call it not making the best decision? Things like that. Tark al-awla, they call it. Which one of these is it? We have to leave that inshallah for our next session, as I said. But here, a question that comes up is, Ayatollah Subhani talked about them not even having a certain disease that turns people away. So brothers and sisters, you tell me, if a person has like big boils on them and warts and pus and blood and juices come out of these warts that they have, and the skin diseases that they have, and the very foul smell that they have, do you think people are drawn towards an individual like this, or are drawn away from them? Of course, we are all drawn away, and we are repelled by them, by this. But we hear that Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam, through the test that Allah gave him, went through this. So the question that comes up here is that, so this has nothing to do with making mistakes, brothers and sisters. It has to do with what he's saying in Article 65, that they shouldn't have anything that turns people off, turns people away from them. The question is, why was Prophet Ayyub like this, we've heard? Does that not turn the people away from him so they don't come for him for guidance when he's suffering from these illnesses? I like the answer that's given here. As a matter of fact, I learned this today. I never knew this myself. The footnote says, therefore, some of the reports after Ayatollah Subhani explains, and he says that prophets can't turn people away with certain diseases they might even have, or certain traits they might have, and things like that. He says, therefore, some of the reports concerning Prophet Ayyub relating to his undergoing the trial of various repulsive diseases are not only in direct contradiction with the decisive judgment of the intellect that, look, a prophet cannot be in a way that they repel people from them, but also stand in opposition to various sayings of the Imams. So it goes against what we've concluded with our intellect, one, and two, goes against other hadiths that we have, some of these reports. So apparently these reports are not coming from proper Shia sources, the ones that say Prophet Ayyub had certain diseases that turned everyone away from him. Okay, well, can you share some of those with us? Ayatollah Subhani, he says that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam relates on the authority of his illustrious forefathers, the Imams before him, that Prophet Ayyub, throughout his illnesses, emitted no bad odor, nor did he become in any way ugly, nor did his body release any pus, blood, or other substance such as might repel people. Wow, look at that. So it's as if this idea of prophets not being infallible, or this has nothing to do with infallibility, prophets, this idea of prophets not being repulsive is an idea that the Imams wanted to drive home amongst the people. And that's why they're coming here kind of exonerating Prophet Ayyub of this of this maybe this bad image that he's being tainted with, really, and trying to make sure that people know that no, his illnesses were a lot. His illnesses were severe. He was in a lot of pain, but it wasn't anything that would turn people away from him either. No. This is very cool. I love it. Ayatollah Subhani goes on to say, Imam as-Sadiq goes on to say, it is ever thus in the way of God for His prophets and saints, never to be a source of repulsion for their people. People distanced themselves from Ayyub because of his poverty and his apparent weakness, but they were unaware of his lofty station in the divine proximity of Allah. So wow, people might have been turned away. So look, I'm going to end with this, brothers and sisters. People can be repelled from a prophet for one of two reasons. One, because of things that the prophet has of traits of their body and even personality traits and things like that. That's something that Ayatollah Subhani says Allah will get in the way of. He won't let them be in a way that they're turned off by the prophets. Yes, they won't be maybe the most beautiful of people even, although they say Prophet Yusuf was very beautiful, others were beautiful, but it's not like they're the most beautiful of their time. That's not a condition necessarily. But they can't be in a way that they turn people off. Sometimes, though, people are repelled for the wrong reasons. The wrong reasons. Right? God forbid, if a prophet smells like feces all the time, people will not be able to go to him all the time, will not feel comfortable. And that's a justified reason to not spend too much time with that person. But poverty, just because a prophet is poor, just because a prophet is going through tough times, just because a prophet is speaking truth. Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, after hundreds of years, was only able to, they say, bring in a handful of people to embrace the faith of monotheism and tawheed. Yeah? Others were repelled by him for the wrong reasons. So God isn't going to get in the way of that part. We have to understand. When we say that God is going to make the prophets in a way that people are not repelled from them, He's going to make them in a way that they're not repelled from them, like physically and stuff like that. Those are okay. But when it comes to people being repelled because the prophet is speaking the truth, because the prophet says, hey, you have monetary dues, you have to pay some money to God, things like that, and they're repelled by that, no, that's not acceptable. Those are not justifications for you to not go to that prophet to learn what he has to say. Yeah. So what Ayatollah Subhani is here is saying, God will get in the way of all of the right reasons why people might be repelled from an individual. Make sure the prophets don't bear such traits so that people can comfortably go to them and ask them their questions and learn the religion and the teachings of the religion from them. Okay. That is Article 65. Article 66 goes into the actual question that some of you had a few minutes ago, about, okay, if they don't make mistakes and all that, then why is it that we see that there are lots of verses that might imply mistakes or mistakeful judgments that were made by these prophets who have infallibility? We'll have to talk about that next session. Wa alaikum assalam, Brother Abbas. Welcome to our session. We're almost done, actually. So anyway, I just want to say one more time, I said this in the beginning as well, that the Ramadan flyer for Mizan live sessions, which came out in the beginning of Ramadan, the dates that were assigned to me, those were subject to change or even cancellation, and I'm not going to be available for the next couple of weeks, and so probably after Eid and after Ramadan is over, I'll be continuing my sessions, but Shaykh Mahdi's sessions will be going on according to the flyer, inshaAllah ta'ala. So make sure to tune in to those as well. As I've said before, share these videos with whoever you think needs to hear them. They will be uploaded later as well. There's a YouTube channel too. People do message me here and there talking about how they want to learn more about Islam and stuff. I think these sessions are very informative for them. Not too deep, but not too superficial either. So whoever you feel really needs these discussions, let them know so that they can follow as well. I know that a lot of people don't have the time to tune in when it's happening live, but alhamdulillah, lots of people are, giving us feedback about, how they're getting a chance to follow them later. So we thank Allah for that. So inshallah, from start of next week, I will not have my session on Tuesdays all the way till after Ramadan ends. Yeah. And inshallah, I hope everyone has a wonderful Ramadan and a wonderful next half of Ramadan, and makes the most of their nights of Qadr, keeps us in their du'as, keeps the Institute in their du'as, and that they are safe and healthy and sound, and that they have a wonderful Eid as well. Thank you very much once again. As I said, we will discuss the questions you were asking in the following articles because he has addressed them there, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.